Alrighty, so today we're going to be in a photo editing app called Adobe Lightroom. And this is the app that I personally use for both organization and the review of my images. And I like it because it's a kind of all-in-one kind of solution, and it's fairly easy and straightforward to understand and pick up. And I personally use the classic version of Lightroom. And I do this because the newer version of Lightroom has this thing where you have to pay for cloud storage, which is fine. But when you have literally dozens of terabytes of storage, having them all on the cloud at once is just not practical. So that's why I use the classic version. Now, I have an entire course on Adobe Lightroom, and in that course, I walk through absolutely everything there is to know, from how to import your images, how to organize them, how to edit, how to export, everything. And if you want to check that out, then you can do so over on my website at patk.com. Today's lesson is going to be a very rough walkthrough on the workflow for the editing portion of the post process. Rather than showing you absolutely everything there is to know in Lightroom, I'm going to be walking through the workflow of how you want to be thinking about editing your images in a way that is app agnostic, so that you can then get out there and explore all of the different image editing apps first, and then decide which one is the best fit for you, because that might not be Lightroom. Keep your options open and experiment around, and remember that we're talking about the concepts here, not the actual tools themselves. Okay, so what we've got here is an image that I shot at Mount Fuji. Here is a fisherman in a boat in Lake Kawaguchiko, and the fisherman here really serves as the main subject of this image. In terms of settings here, my settings on the top left here, so 1/2500th of a second at f1.4 at ISO 100 on an 85mm lens. Now I shot it in this way because I wanted the fisherman in the middle here at the bottom to be the focus of the image, to be the subject of the image. So I deliberately shot it at f1.4 so that I could get some level of shallow depth of field, so that when you're looking at the image, okay, this person down here is sharp and is in focus, whereas the background and the mountain are slightly out of focus and they aren't as important in this image. So in terms of how to think about an edit when you're approaching any editing software, we are first thinking about the foundations, and the foundations is always about exposure. So at this stage of the process, I want to be looking for any kind of exposure changes that I would need to make ahead of time to kind of flatten out the image and make sure that I have the most amount of detail to work with. So what I can see here in the histogram on the top right here is that the blacks and the whites are fairly good. There's no clipped areas here, so that's totally fine. What I can do here, though, is the histogram looks a little bit to the left to my eye, so I can actually take the exposure and just drag it up just a little bit. And you can see the histogram change when I change the exposure here, like so. That to me looks a little bit more in the center in terms of exposure, and we can see that a lot of the highlights here on the mountain, a lot of the shadows here down on the lake have just been brought up just a smidge. Usually here at this point, if I see any highlights or any black details that are too far gone, then I will then go and change them here manually in the basic tone, like so. In this instance, they look totally fine to me, and I might actually just taper off some of the highlights here on the mountain like so, and then bring up the whites as well at the same time, so I can bring the brightness of them but keep the detail at the same time. And then what I'm noticing on this image here is that even though the histogram says that the shadows are totally fine, in these shadows here, especially down in this tunnel right here, I can see that from my eyes on my monitor, it looks a little bit dark. So I'm just going to bring the shadows up just a little bit like so, just to get some of that detail back. And then I'm going to bring down some of the blacks to keep the contrast at a similar level, but increase the amount of detail that I have as well. So that looks pretty good to me. The next step typically is about adding contrast. So contrast is really important in terms of starting to shape the image and the mood and the vibe that it has. The thing about contrast is that it adds a lot of color natively, and that's why it's second in terms of what you want to be looking at in terms of your overall workflow when you're editing an image. And this will make a little bit more sense in just a minute. In Lightroom, we add contrast by using the tone curve. And the tone curve that I specifically like to use is this point curve here. So for this tone curve, what I'm going to do is add an S curve, kind of like this, and add a couple of points and stretch out this high portion here and this lower portion here. And that is the highlights and the shadows respectively. And what this does is it increases the amount of contrast in the image. We'll also bring up the mid-tones point here. And this starts to increase a lot of the saturation in the colors at the same time. So this is really important to note. When you're adding contrast, it adds color as well. So now that I'm happy with the contrast here, the next step is to look at the color. And when you're assessing any image editing app, you want comprehensive color controls, because editing is a lot to do with color. Exposure and color are your two big pillars when it comes to your overall workflow in the post process. So in this portion, what I'm going to be doing is adjusting color. And down here, we have the HSL sliders, and this controls all of the hue, saturation, and luminance for this entire image. And we can see that the hue will change the colors of whatever particular region you select it on. The saturation controls how intense that color might be. And then the luminosity controls how bright that particular region will be in terms of its color. So whether, in this instance, this blue is a dark kind of blue or this blue is a light kind of blue. Now from here, color is really subjective, and it's really up to your personal preference and a lot of experimentation as to where you want to push the different colors and in what direction and in what intensities. And so this portion of the image editing process for me is usually actually quite long. It takes quite a while for me to fine tune and tweak all of the little individual color sliders to the point that I get happy with it. And so I'm just going to skip forward a little bit for this process. Okay, so now I've done some adjustments for the colors, and honestly, it is a pretty neutral look, I would say. But here are all of the settings that I changed for the colors here. And in Lightroom, we have lots of different options for changing colors. We have, HSL, we have the calibration tools, we have up here in the global vibrance and saturation controls that we can also change. We also have color grading and adding more color effects to the image as well. And I went ahead and added all of those in this process. So from here, this is kind of, for me, the baseline foundation. This is the point where the image looks good as it is, but we can always add more to it. We can add some dimensionality to it and a little bit of extras to it if we so wish. And for this, in Lightroom specifically, I love to use the masking features, and this is one of the big reasons why I use Lightroom, is because the masking features are quite good. And so from here with the masking, what I'll think about is, okay, what are the portions of this image that I want to bring out and accentuate, and what are the portions of this image that are not so important, and how can I reduce the amount of visual weighting and visual importance in those portions. So for this specific image, as we established already, the fisherman down at the bottom is the most important part of this image, and the scale between him and Mount Fuji is very, very important to me. So what I want to do is try and accentuate this this fisherman down here in the best way that I can, and then I still want to keep Mount Fuji quite predominant. But what I'm also seeing in this image, and one of the things that originally caught my eye to it, is the light. So this particular light is coming in from the right. As you can see on the mountain here, there is a whole bunch of highlights on this side, and I want to bring that out and shape the light a little bit in this respect. So we'll start with that because that may determine how the rest of the image goes. So we'll add what's called a gradient mask here. So we can do this, and we'll bring this out just a little bit. And so it's red as an overlay just to show you where the actual mask is going to get affected, but we can press O to get rid of that. And then we're going to add a little bit of negative clarity, a little bit of negative dehaze for some haze as well. And then just a little bit more exposure just to make things a smidge brighter. And then we're going to add some warmth in terms of temperature as well, just to give it a little bit of a warm glow. From here, what we're actually going to do is we're going to come to this menu and duplicate and invert the mask. And that's going to give us a mask for pretty much the rest of the frame. And so what we can do here now is if we get rid of that mask is we can reduce the overall amount of exposure here just by a little bit. And then reduce the shadows as well, just by a little bit as well. And now we're introducing, again, more contrast and more shape to the light. And we can see that this portion of the mountain, for my personal preference, is a lot more accentuated than what it was previously. However, because of that, the shadows for the fishermen down here are quite a lot lower than they were before. So what I'm going to do is add a linear gradient down here. Just like that, something quite loose, doesn't have to be perfect. And we're actually going to increase the shadows here. And then decrease the highlights just a little bit as well, just to flatten out this base a little bit. Now, there are also a lot of ripples and little, I would say, texture, I suppose, on the water due to just how much wind there was when I originally shot this image, and shooting it at such a fast shutter speed as well. So what I'm going to do is actually reduce the amount of texture just to smoothen this water out just a little bit. And then I'm going to give it a negative clarity there as well. And that looks good to me. So that just has the effect of slightly smoothing out the water just a little bit. And then from there, I want to try and accentuate him a little bit more. So we're going to go with another radial gradient and just kind of very loosely put it over the top of him. And we're going to increase the exposure just by a little bit, just a very tiny amount, just enough to bring him out just a little bit, but not enough for you to be able to see that we've got a linear gradient over the top of him. We also want to increase the clarity on him just a little bit and increase the texture on him just a little bit as well, just to make him a little bit more sharper and a little bit more defined. Now from there, I've actually zoomed into him a little bit more, and I want to actually paint in his jacket so that I can make it pop out more and stand out just a little bit more. So with a feather of around midway and then a very high flow, what I want to just start doing is just painting around. Doesn't have to be super accurate, but just enough to get the majority of his jacket, and then a little bit on his arm as well, just like this. All right, that looks good to me. And then maybe a little bit on his mask here and on his hat. Cool, that looks good. And I want to just increase the exposure just a little bit. Nothing too crazy. And it does help to, if you're doing this, zoom out and just see for yourself how much exposure is the perfect amount relative to the rest of the scene. So that looks about good to me. I might increase the saturation on that as well, just a little bit more. And then that's pretty much it. I like that. So a couple of other things we could do at this point are, a little bit more fine details. Things like adding vignette or sharpening. In Lightroom, they have this sharpening control here where you're able to control the exact portions of where the image sharpening goes on this image. So something like that would be good for me. And then I will, add something like a very sort of gradiented vignette, just a very slight one, nothing too extreme. And then a couple of other things we can do here that I typically like to do quite often is stretching out the aspect ratio just a little bit. So you can actually do that as a transform is what it's called in Lightroom. And that just makes the mountain just a little bit taller. Something like this. That looks good to me. And then from here, we can crop it. So using this tool up here on the right, we can crop it to whatever size we want to. So depending on whether or not you are posting it on Instagram, or you want to post it on your website as a full landscape or something like that, whatever the case may be, we can crop it to whatever size we desire. And that's pretty much it for the edit itself. From there, we want to think about exporting. And when we're talking about exporting, we can change all of these different parameters to whatever we would like. We could change the size, we can change the sharpening on the way out, and all of those other dimensions. We can change the export locations, and again, I won't go too much into detail, but we want to basically change the pixels and the sharpening for the relative platforms that we would then be posting it on. All right, so those are all the broad brushstrokes that you'll be looking for when you're editing your images from a workflow perspective, and you're evaluating all of those different image editing apps. Now, something to remember here is that subtlety is key, just in general, and usually less is more. And I know a lot of you will start getting excited using wacky colors or HDR or what have you. Everyone kind of goes through that stage. But as you get more and more refined in your approach, you'll start to see that your editing workflow should actually be quite short per image, and it'll actually shorten even more as the years go by. All right, today's assignment is more familiarization. So in your editing app of choice, I want you to edit one image, but in 3 different ways. First, edit the image in a way that you would normally do it. Then save that, export that, or snapshot the settings for later. And then reset the image, and then edit it in a film way. Whatever you think that means to you, just for fun. It might help to actually look up some film style images on Google first for some inspiration, but edit it in a film way, and then save that, export that, or snapshot those settings as well. And then finally, reset everything once more and edit the image in a very dark, moody way. Again, just for fun. Now, once you have all 3, take a look at them all and compare those images against each other, and look for just how far you can change the overall look and feel and vibe of an image with editing alone. Editing is very powerful if you know what you're doing, and this is what today's assignment is all about, realizing that. All right, see you tomorrow.